Clara sat at the defense table, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, her lips tightly pressed together in silence. She broke down as the Child Protection Agency recommended to the court that she be stripped of her custody rights due to accusations of neglecting her 4-year-old son George. Cold, judgmental eyes stared at her, and the harsh words felt like daggers piercing her heart. She questioned what more she could do to keep George by her side. A mother's love can endure hunger, exhaustion, and the world's harshest criticisms, but when that love is misunderstood as neglect, who will step up to prove otherwise? Clara stirred from sleep, the thin blanket barely offering warmth against the morning chill that crept through the cracks of her small, worn-down apartment. The light filtering through the dusty window was dim, yet it wasn't enough to remind her that another long day awaited. She shifted quietly, glancing at George still curled up under a blanket on the makeshift bed nearby, his small form rising and falling with each innocent breath. She sighed, running a hand through her tangled hair, and pushed herself up. The kitchen was bare save for the few cans and a box of cereal she had rationed out over the week. Clara opened the fridge, just a bit of milk left, not enough for the two of them, but enough for George. She poured it carefully over the last handful of cereal, setting the bowl on the table. "Morning, buddy," she whispered. When George's sleepy eyes opened, he blinked and gave a sleepy smile, rubbing his eyes as he padded over to the table. "Morning, Mommy," he mumbled, dragging a chair out and climbing up. His innocence, his untainted joy, was what kept Clara going through her body ache. With fatigue, she sat across from him, resting her chin in her hand as she watched him eat, her stomach grumbling quietly she'd eat later. Maybe her mind drifted to John. The memory of his face, pale and gaunt from the last months of his illness, still haunted her. Cancer had taken him, but not before it drained their savings, leaving Era to pick up the pieces of a life she hadn't imagined living alone. She glanced at George, who hummed to himself between spoonfuls, oblivious to the weight on her shoulders, the burden of being both mother and father. The worry about rent, food, and whether she could keep up with everything loomed over her daily. When George finished, Clara smiled faintly and gathered the bowl. "Go get dressed, sweetie. We've got a big day." George nodded, skipping off with the lightness only a child could muster as she washed the bowl, the tap water running cold. Clara's thoughts returned to her daily grind. Cleaning hotel rooms wasn't glamorous. It was hard, backbreaking work, and the tips weren't enough to make ends meet, but it was all she had every day. She scrubbed and polished her body, begging for a break, yet she couldn't stop. George needed her. He needed clothes, school supplies, and most of all, a mother who didn't give up. By mid morning, Clara was on her way to the hotel. The walk was long, and the crisp air didn't help the ache in her muscles. Inside the hotel, her boss, Mr. Daniels, gave her a concerned look as she clocked in, his eyebrows knit together, and he sighed heavily. "Clara, you've been looking run down lately. Everything okay?" She forced a smile, nodding. "Yes, everything's fine. Look, I know you've got a lot going on, but you're no good to me if you collapse from exhaustion. Take care of yourself, okay?" Clara nodded again, the words hollow as she tucked them away. There was no time to slow down, no room for weakness. She had to keep pushing no matter what the shift dragged off on. Each room seemed more exhausting than the last. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, her legs felt like lead. She headed home only to find her neighbor Missy waiting on the stoop, her arms crossed. "You know," Missy began, eyeing Clara up and down. "George was crying again this afternoon. Poor thing, probably hungry. You really ought to take better care of him. And those clothes he's been wearing, the same jacket for weeks. Kids need proper care." Clara clenched her jaw, but kept her response measured. "Thanks for your concern, Missy. I'm doing my best." Missy snorted, brushing past her and disappearing into her own apartment. Clara stood there for a moment, breathing deeply. The weight of judgment was familiar by now, but that didn't make it any lighter. Inside, George was already asleep, his small body curled up under the blanket. Clara knelt beside him, smoothing his hair and whispering softly, "I'm sorry, baby. Mommy's trying." As she stood and looked around the tiny apartment, the cracks in the walls, the threadbare furniture, Clara's heart tightened. Tomorrow would be just as hard, if not harder, but she had to keep going for George, for herself, and somehow that had to be enough. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her worn shoes, their soles almost as thin as the hope she clung to. She'd brought home leftover sandwiches from work again. Her colleagues didn't notice she never ate her own lunch, always saving it for George, but it was getting harder to hide her fatigue, the goring hunger in her belly. Every bite she didn't take was for him, and each sacrifice seemed to deepen the bags under her eyes. Still, when George's laughter echoed in their small apartment, all those sacrifices felt Lighter, almost bearable. Mommy, look at what I drew. George rushed over, waving a sheet of crumpled paper with a messy drawing of a house and a sun that seemed too big for the sky. His smile was wide. Unaware of the struggles his mother carried, unaware of the choices she made every day to ensure he had more than she did. Clara forced a smile, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it masked the exhaustion that weighed her down. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Is that US? George nodded eagerly. Yep. And that's our house. When I grow up, I'm going to make it real big so we don't have to share walls with neighbors. Clara ruffled his hair, her throat tight. She wished he didn't have to dream of such things, but at the same time, she was thankful he still had dreams. He hadn't yet realized the enormity of what they lacked. The weekend came, and as promised, Clara took George to the park. She hadn't slept well the night before, her body sore from long hours of scrubbing floors at the hotel. Still, the thought of disappointing George weighed heavier than her own exhaustion. At the park, she settled on a bench, watching as George ran off to the swings, his little leg pumping with excitement. She closed her eyes for just a second, at least that's what she told herself. But that second turned into minutes, her body succumbing to the tiredness she'd tried to push away all week. A sudden choking sound yanked Clara from her brief slumber. She bolted upright, her heart in her throat, as she saw George clutching his throat, his eyes wide with panic. He had found a coin on the ground and put it in his mouth, only to choke on it. Clara's legs felt like lead as she rushed to him, her hands shaking as she tried to remember what to do. Please, somebody help, she cried out, her voice cracking with desperation. The few people around glanced over but hesitated, unsure if they should get involved. Clara's world spun, her thoughts a blur of panic and helplessness. George's small body cone pulsed, and she could see the terror in his eyes. A man tall and solid rushed over without hesitation. He bent down and struck George firmly on the feet. Back, the coin dislodged, and George gasped, coughing as he clung to Clara, who was shaking uncontrollably. Thank you, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she hugged her son tightly. The man simply nodded, his expression softening before he walked away. Nearby, a woman named Julia, one of the other parents from George's class, had seen the entire incident. Her eyes followed Clara as she sat back down, clutching George close. Julia's lips pressed into a thin line, and she quickly pulled out her phone, typing something before turning away. The next morning, Clara could feel the weight of the judgmental stares as she walked George to school. The whispers followed her words like irresponsible and negligent, floating just within earshot. She kept her head down, gripping George's hand a little tighter, as if holding on to him could shield her from the harshness of the world around them. Back at home, Clara sank into a chair. She refused to ask for help, refused to admit that she was struggling to keep her head above water. The idea of losing George was more terrifying than anything else she knew. If anyone found out just how bad things had become, they might take him away, and that was a risk she wasn't willing to take. As Clara stared at the old wallpaper peeling from the walls, she realized that the burden of poverty wasn't just about hunger or exhaustion. It was about isolation, about the crushing weight of knowing that the world didn't just ignore you but judged you too. Clara sat anxiously in the small, brightly lit office across from her. George's teacher, Mrs. Bennett, sat with a concerned expression. She sighed and glanced at the papers on her desk before speaking. Clara, we need to talk about George. Her voice was gentle but firm. There have been some concerns from the staff about his appearance and behavior. He's often hungry and his clothes aren't suitable for the weather. Is everything okay at home? Clara swallowed hard, her heart racing. She forced a smile and waved off the concern, though her hands trembled. Oh, Mrs. Bennett, George is just a growing boy. He plays so hard. He's bound to get hungry quicker than others, and well, it's been a bit tight lately. But I'm managing. Mrs. Bennett frowned, her eyes softening. I know things are hard, Clara, but we just want to make sure George is getting what he needs. If you need help, there are resources. I can take care of my son. Clara interrupted a bit too sharply, then softened. I appreciate your concern, but I'm doing the best I can. The meeting ended with little resolution, but the knot in Clara's stomach tightened. She could feel the judgment lurking behind Mrs. Bennett's kind eyes, as if she were silently calculating the number of meals George might have missed. Walking out of the school, the cold wind bit at her cheeks. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her, but it did little to stop the chill both outside and within. As George grew, so did his appetite. The food she managed to scrape together seemed to vanish faster, no matter how hard Clara tried. Rent was always due, and every bill seemed to grow larger than the last two. Keep up, she had taken on a late-night job cleaning offices, but that meant leaving George alone at home in the evenings. It wasn't ideal, but she had no other option. One freezing winter night, Clara was dragging herself down the street. After finishing her shift, her limbs were heavy with exhaustion and the goring hunger in her. Her stomach was impossible to ignore. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck, but the wind still cut through. Just then she noticed a discarded cigarette on the sidewalk, still smoldering. Without thinking, she bent down, picked it up, and took a long drag, hoping the brief warmth would soothe her. She closed her eyes and exhaled, her breath mixing with the smoke and the cold. "Ayer, Clara," a voice broke through the darkness. She froze, turning to see her neighbor Missy staring at her from across the street, eyes wide with shock. Clara quickly dropped the cigarette, stamping it out with her boot. But the damage was done by the next morning. The rumors had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Missy, of course, hadn't wasted any time. Clara's supposed neglect of George, combined with the sight of her smoking on the street, fueled the gossip. At school, parents whispered in hushed tones when they saw her, their eyes filled with judgment. "Poor George," they would murmur, shaking their heads. "She can't even keep herself together." Clara walked through the neighborhood with her head down, feeling the weight of their stares. It was as if the whole world had turned against her. The more she tried to focus on her work and caring for George, the heavier the burden grew inside her apartment. Clara sat by the window, watching as George played quietly with his toys. His small face was serious, his once boisterous energy now subdued. The noise of the world outside, the gossip, the accusations, the disapproving glances, felt like a storm she couldn't escape. The breaking point came one cold afternoon when Clara opened her mailbox and found a letter from the Social Services Department. It was a notice. Someone had reported concerns about George's well-being and a KSU worker would be visiting soon. Clara stood frozen, the paper crumpling in her hands as her eyes scanned the words again and again. Her throat tightened and tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her worst fear had come true. She had always known deep down that things might spiral out of control, but now it was real. The whispers weren't just whispers anymore. They were actions, threats to her very ability to keep George safe with her. She slumped into a worn chair by the window, her hands trembling as the letter fell to the floor. Outside, the world went on, but Clara felt like hers was closing in. The walls shrinking, the doors slowly shutting her in, and in the middle of it all, George was the one who would pay the price. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her fingers clenched around a cold mug, the remnants of stale coffee long forgotten. The faint sound of knocking echoed through the thin walls of her apartment. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks on her tired mind, but the pounding grew louder and more urgent. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady, as if they knew something she didn't. Opening the door, she was met by two figures, a tall woman in a stiff suit, her social services badge glinting in the dim light, and a police officer, his expression unreadable but firm. "Clara Evans?" the woman asked her, voice professional but devoid of warmth. Clara nodded, her heart tightening. "What's going on?" "We've received reports of neglect and possible abuse regarding your son George. We need to talk," the woman said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Clara's breath hitched. Abuse, neglect, the words felt foreign in her mouth. She stood frozen, struggling to comprehend. "That's not true. I would never hurt George." The officer, who had remained silent, took a step forward. "Mom, we need you to cooperate. This is for George's safety." Panic surged through Clara. She moved to stand between them and the small bedroom where George was still sleeping. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "I work all day. I do my best. He's my world." The social worker's gaze softened just a little. "We're not here to make judgments right now, Clara, but we do need to take George for further evaluation. This isn't permanent, but we need to ensure his safety." Clara's chest tightened, and she struggled to breathe. "You can't take him from me," she whispered, almost as if saying it softly would make it less real. The woman motioned to the officer, and Clara felt her legs go weak. George's door creaked open, and she watched helplessly as they woke him, his small face crumpling in confusion. "Mom." George's voice was thick with sleep, his eyes wide as he tried to process the strange people in his room. "It's okay, baby," Clara tried to say, but her voice cracked. She reached out, desperate to hold him, but the officer stepped between them. George clung to her leg, tears beginning to form. "I don't want to go," he sobbed, his tiny fists clutching her jeans. Clara knelt, her hands trembling as she held his face. "I'm right here," she whispered, forcing a smile through the agony. "I'll be right here when you come back." But the moment felt like a lie. It felt as if the walls of the apartment were closing and suffocating her. The officer gently but firmly lifted George into his arms, and Clara's heart shattered as George's cries echoed through the apartment. She felt her body being pulled away, her hands reaching out in desperation as the door closed between them. The sound of George's cries faded into the hallway, leaving an unbearable silence behind. Hours passed, though they felt like seconds, and Clara found herself sitting in a sterile cold room at the police station. The fluorescent lights above her flickered, casting harsh shadows across the walls across from her. A detective flipped through a folder, the sound of paper filling the silence. You've had some trouble keeping steady employment, he said, without looking up. Clara's eyes burned, but she blinked back the tears. I've done everything I can, she muttered the words, barely audible. I work 2 jobs. George is all I have left. The detective glanced at her, his face impassive. The reports say George is often hungry. His clothes are sometimes insufficient for the weather. Neighbors have heard him crying frequently. Does any of this sound familiar? Clara's throat tightened. I've done my best. It's not easy, but I'm not a bad mother. The detective's gaze was steady. That's not for me to decide, but you need to understand that this isn't going to be easy. The court is going to look at all the evidence. They left her alone in the small cold room. After the questioning, her hands trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of it all pressed down on her chest, suffocating her mind kept returning to George's face, the way he had clung to her, the fear in his eyes. And now she sat in a cell, awaiting the beginning of the trial, terrified that she might lose him forever. The walls around her felt too close, the silence too loud. The only thing she could cling to was the faint hope that somehow she would find a way to bring George home, but even that hope felt fragile, slipping through her fingers like sand. The courthouse was buzzing with restless energy. Reporters jostled for space, their cameras flashing. As Clara stepped out of the police van, her face was pale, her eyes tired but resolute. The media frenzy surrounding the case had already painted her as a careless mother. Headlines screamed accusations, twisting every sacrifice she had made for George into a scandal. Clara could hear them talking, whispered judgments in the crowd, branding her as negligent, irresponsible. It made her stomach turn, but she said nothing. Inside the courtroom, the tension thickened. Clara's public defender, Sarah, sat beside her, a determined yet calm expression on her face. Sarah had been assigned by a human rights organization, and despite the odds, she had faith in her client. But Clara, she wasn't so sure. Shame and fear were crushing her voice. Clara, Sarah whispered, leaning closer, I know this is overwhelming, but you have to speak up. Tell them the truth. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about George. Clara clenched her fists under the table. Speak up. How could she? The thought of exposing her life, laying her failures bare in front of everyone, it made her feel small, powerless. What if she lost him for good? What if they took George away? The judge entered and the room fell silent. The trial had begun. The prosecution wasted no time calling witnesses. First, the neighbor Missy took the stand. She glanced coldly in Clara's direction before launching into her testimony. I've lived next to Clara for years, Missy began, her voice thick with steam. I've seen her smoking on the balcony while her boy is inside crying. And that apartment, it's a wreck, filthy, no place for a child. She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, I think she's an addict. That's what it looks like to me. Clara's stomach dropped. It wasn't true. Well, the smoking part was. But it wasn't what Missy made it seem. It was the one moment of the day when Clara could breathe just for a second. In the midst of chaos, she had never once neglected George, but Mrs. words sliced through her defenses like a blade cutting deep. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Next, a teacher from George's school testified. She described a boy who was often hungry, dressed in worn clothes, and sometimes absent. Without explanation, Clara's eyes burned, but she didn't blink. She knew how it looked from the outside. She knew what they thought of her. And then came the social worker. Her words felt like nails in the coffin. Conditions in the apartment were concerning, the social worker stated. There was very little food in the fridge. The place was cluttered, and George wasn't in the best shape. It's clear that his basic needs aren't being met. Sarah shifted beside Clara, her lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't going well. Every word from the witnesses reinforced the narrative that had been built against Clara, but Sarah wasn't ready to give up. When the time came for Sarah to cross-examine, she approached the social worker with a steady voice. Miss Jones, Sarah began, you mentioned the apartment was cluttered and there was little food. Did you also take into account that Clara works 2 jobs and has been trying to provide for her son with minimal resources? Did you see evidence that Clara was actively neglecting George? Or is it possible that she's just struggling like so many single parents are? The social worker hesitated, glancing At the prosecutor before responding, it's possible she's struggling, but it doesn't change the fact that George's needs aren't being met. Clara's heart raced. She could feel Sarah's frustration, but more than that, she felt her own fear rising. How could she convince them of the truth when everything looked so damning? Clara, you need to say something, Sarah urged again as they sat down. This is your chance to fight for him. But Clara couldn't. Shame was wrapped around her throat, strangling the words before they could leave her mouth. What if no matter what she said, they wouldn't believe her? What if they took George away forever? So she stayed silent, her fear winning over the truth as the trial continued. The courtroom was hushed, a thick tension filling the air. Clara sat at the defense table, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, her body still from the weight of the moment. The accusations against her were serious, the evidence thin, but the consequences threatened to tear her life apart. She stared at her hands clasped tightly in her lap, hoping for a miracle. Suddenly, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. All eyes turned as Sarah, Clara's lawyer, led a small figure down the aisle. George, clutching a bundle of papers in his small hands, walked slowly toward the front. His tiny frame seemed even smaller in the imposing room, but his face held a determination beyond his years. Your Honor, Sarah addressed the judge, I'd like to call George, Clara's son, to the stand. The judge, an older man with graying hair and a skeptical gaze, nodded. Intrigued by the unusual turn of events, George climbed onto the witness chair, his legs dangling above the floor. The room held its collective breath as Sarah approached him with gentle steps. George, Sarah began softly, kneeling beside him. Do you want to show everyone what you brought with you today? George nodded earnestly, his small hands trembling as he unfolded the crumpled papers. He held up the first, drawing a messy, colorful image of a woman standing in front of a stove, a pot steaming on the burner. This is my mommy, he said quietly, but his voice carried through the room. She makes my food every day. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the child's innocent face. He continued, holding up another picture, this one of a bed with his mother sitting beside it, a hand resting on his head. She sings to me when I go to sleep, George explained. She says she loves me every night. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The jury shifted in their seats, and even the judge's expression softened. George, oblivious to the effect he was having, shuffled through his drawings and paused, his eyes lighting up as he found his favorite. This is the house I'm going to build for mommy when I'm big, he said proudly, lifting up a picture of a large, sprawling home. It's going to have so much food and she'll never be hungry again. The simplicity of his words hit the room like a wave. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she watched her son speak, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and pain. She hadn't known he understood so much. There was a collective sniffle from the jury, even the judge, a stoic man who had been unflinchingly impartial until now, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Blinking rapidly, Sarah allowed the moment to sink in before stepping closer to the witness stand. George, has your mom ever hurt you or made you feel unsafe? She asked gently. George shook his head, his brow furrowing in confusion. No, she takes care of me. She always does, satisfied. Sarah turned toward the judge. No further questions. The judge cleared his throat, clearly moved. Thank you, George. You can go sit with your lawyer now. George slid off the chair and returned to Sarah's side, his testimony hanging in the air like a beacon of truth. Next, it was Clara's turn. She stood slowly, her body trembling as she walked to the stand. Sarah gave her a reassuring nod before she began to speak. I never let my son go hungry, Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. Every meal he's had in these last months has come from my share. I would go without food before I ever let him suffer. Her words were laced with desperation, but they carried the weight of a mother's love. She glanced over at George, who was watching her with wide, trusting eyes. He's everything to me. I've done all I can to protect him. As Clara spoke, a kind colleague from the hotel stood up, asked to be heard. I've seen her eat the leftovers from our break room, the woman testified, her voice steady. She's not an addict, she's just a mother doing her best. Then even Missy, the prickly neighbor, stepped forward. I've never seen Clara lay a hand on that boy, she muttered grudgingly. He may cry sometimes, but she's never been cruel. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Where once there had been suspicion, there was now compassion. The judge leaned forward, his eyes glistening with emotion as he addressed Clara directly. Your son's testimony and the words of those who know you have shed light on this case, he said quietly. This court has heard your story and we understand now. The jury nodded, some of them wiping away tears. Clara's shoulders sagged in relief, her heart finally releasing the tension she had held for so long. George's drawings had spoken louder than any legal argument ever could, painting a picture of a mother's Love that no one in the room could deny. The judge glanced at the papers in front of him, but it was clear the decision had already been made. The courtroom was unnervingly silent as the jury deliberated. The ladder of the gavel and the judge's final instructions still lingered in the air. Clara sat motionless at the defense table, her fingers tightly intertwined, the tension visible in the way she held her breath. Across the room, George sat quietly with a social worker, his small body barely filling the seat. His wide, innocent eyes scanned the unfamiliar room, too young to fully grasp the weight of what was happening, but sensitive enough to know that it was important. The jury had listened to hours of testimony, stories that painted Clara as both a struggling mother and a negligent one. Her truth had been laid bare, woven through with memories of John's illness, the pain of raising George alone, and the relentless pressure of poverty. Clara had never tried to hide it. She spoke of the cold mornings, the scarce food, and the exhaustion that became her daily companion. Yet through it all, George had always been her priority. She had protected him the best she could, even when the world thought she was failing. As the minutes ticked by, Clara's mind wandered, replaying the faces of the people who had once judged her so harshly. There was Missy, the neighbor, who always had something to say about George's clothes or the tears that sometimes spilled when he was tired or hungry. And there was Mr. Thompson, the hotel manager, who questioned her fitness for work, subtly implying that perhaps George deserved better than what she could offer. They had seen only the surface of her life, a single mother struggling to keep up appearances. But now, as the truth unfolded in the courtroom, their glances shifted. What had once been judgment had slowly transformed into quiet reflection. The door creaked open, and the jury filed back into the room. Clara's stomach twisted into knots, her pulse quickening. But George, sensing the shift in the room, turned his eyes towards her. He gave her a small, hesitant smile, a silent gesture of comfort that made Clara's heart swell and ache. All at once, the jury has reached a verdict, the foreman announced, his voice steady. The tension in the room grew as everyone held their breath, waiting for what came next. Clara's eyes flickered to the judge, who nodded gravely. The foreman continued, "We find the defendant, Clara Evans, not guilty of child neglect." The words hit Clara like a wave, and for a moment she couldn't move. Relief flooded her, but it was tempered by the exhaust of the long battle she had endured. Then, as if drawn by instinct, she turned to find George's eyes. His face broke into a grin, and she could see the tears welling up in his eyes, matching the ones that now blurred her vision. The judge cleared his throat, his voice taking on a softer tone. "While this court recognizes the significant struggles Miss Henderson has faced, it is clear that her love for her son has never wavered. In light of the circumstances, I ordering that both M. Henderson and George be provided with the necessary support services, including housing and financial assistance. This family needs help, not punishment." For a moment the room was still, then slowly the applause began. It started with a single clap, hesitant and unsure, but soon it grew, filling the room as the weight of Clara's victory spread. Mr. Thompson nodded quite quietly to himself. The community, which had once doubted her, now stood united in their support. Clara rose from her seat, her legs trembling beneath her, and walked toward George. As she reached him, he sprang from his seat, flinging his arms around her with all the force his little body could muster. She held him tightly, burying her face in his hair as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. It wasn't just relief, it was the first time in years that she felt seen, understood, and supported. As the applause echoed around them, Clara whispered into George's ear, "We're going to be okay." And for the first time in a time, she truly believed it. Clara stood at the doorway of the social welfare center, her breath catching in her throat as she waited for the familiar sight of her son. It had been 3 long months since George had been placed in the center, giving her time to settle into her new job at the nearby kindergarten, where she cooked and cleaned every day. It had been a slow, steady climb towards stability. Now she was here to bring George home. The door finally creaked open, and there he was, George, his small face lighting up as he spotted her. Without a word, he ran toward her, his arms outstretched, and she scooped him up. Feeling the weight of him, the warmth of his little body pressing against hers, Clara held him tightly. The months of separation melting away in that single moment. She kissed the top of his head, feeling tears sting her eyes but blinking them back. "Mom, I missed you," George said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I missed you too, baby." Clara replied, her voice soft but steady. She pulled back to look at him, brushing a hand through his tousled hair. "Let's go home." As they walked back to their small apartment, Clara's mind drifted over the past few months. It hadn't been easy, but the distance had given her time to reflect on everything, the exhaustion, the despair. None of it had broken her. She had kept going for George, always for George. That love had been her anchor through everything, and now she could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Once she had feared the future uncertain, if she could provide for her son, now standing on firmer ground, she realized that her love for George had been the most resilient force. It wasn't grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but the quiet daily fight to survive and to care for him that had been her greatest act of love. "Love, I got us here," Clara whispered to herself, though the thought was as much a comfort as it was a quiet affirmation. Her love had been enough. It had carried them through. Back in the neighborhood, Clara was met with warm greetings and nods from people who had once turned their backs on her. Mrs. Missy, the old woman from down the street who used to scowl at George's worn clothes, smiled and waved. "It's good to see you, Clara," she said, and George, two others in the community, had begun to offer help without her asking. It started with small things left over: groceries from the local market, hand-me-down clothes from neighbors whose kids had outgrown them. Slowly, the judgment that had once weighed heavily on her shoulders lifted, replaced with unexpected kindness. Clara had never expected their support, but now it was as though the community had rallied behind her and George. They weren't alone anymore. Later that evening, as Clara tucked George into bed, she sat by his side, listening to his soft breathing as he drifted off to sleep. For the first time in years, she felt something new. Hope. It was a fragile, flickering thing, but it was there, burning quietly in her chest. The past had been harsh, the struggles endless, but now there was a sense of new beginnings. Clara knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she also knew that with the support she had found in the community, she and George could face whatever came next. For so long it had been just the two of them against the world. Now, for the first time, it felt like they had others in their corner. Clara leaned over and kissed George on the forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," in the silence of their tiny apartment. Clara smiled to herself. This wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was one built on love, resilience, and now community. George stirred in his sleep, and she smoothed the blanket over him. The future, for the first time in a long while, didn't feel so frightening. Clara stood up and looked out the small window at the moonlit street below. Whatever happened next, she was ready. The love she had for her son had carried them this far, and it would carry them further still. This was only the beginning. Thank you all for joining me today to hear Clara and George's powerful story of love, resilience, and hope. Their journey reminds us that no matter how difficult the road may seem, with unwavering love and support, we can overcome even the darkest challenges. It's not always easy, but it's those small, everyday acts of courage that lead us toward brighter tomorrows. If you felt inspired by Clara's story, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and lift the spirit. Remember, we're all part of a larger community, and sometimes it's the unexpected kindness from others that makes all the difference. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and keep believing in the power of love and perseverance. See you soon.